So we've gotten to Genesis chapter 30, and just as a reminder, right before this, in chapter 29, we had the marriage of Jacob, and Jacob marries both Leah and Rachel, and it talks about the children that were born to Leah, and so Reuben was born, Simeon was born, Levi, and then Judah. So Leah had 4 sons born to her. And so we're familiar with the story, and we talked about it already. Jacob loved Rachel, and Leah was kind of forced on him to be married. And then, so he ends up with 2 wives. And then God sees that Rachel is the one that's loved, and Leah isn't loved by Jacob. And so God shows pity on Leah and blesses her by giving her more children, or giving her the initial children. And so she gets 4 sons, which was viewed as something that was very positive during those times. And so that's a context going into chapter 30. And so we're going to start with the beginning of chapter 30, verses 1 through 2. It says, "Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister. And she said to Jacob, 'Give me children, or else I die.' Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, 'Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?'" So Rachel has a very natural reaction, because she hadn't born any children, and she ends up being very jealous of Leah, which makes sense. Although, from one perspective, Leah was probably jealous of Rachel because Jacob loved her more, but Rachel really wants to have children. And so what she ends up saying to Jacob is, she says to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." And so we see that Rachel is completely miserable in her situation. She sees that Leah is blessed with 4 children, and she goes to Jacob and she says, "Give me children, or else I die." So we can see that she is greatly troubled by her situation. So now we get to Jacob's reaction to Rachel coming to him. So keep in mind, up until this point, it talks about how much Jacob loves Rachel and how much he cares about her. But his response to her is one of anger. It says that Jacob's anger burned against Rachel. And so we have what seems to be their first fight. And we see that Jacob's not just kind of angry. It seems like he's really angry with Rachel. And he says to her, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" And so what we see in this situation is that Rachel is completely frustrated with her situation. And her response is to go to Jacob and almost blame him. And she's telling him to give her children. And Jacob, understandably, becomes angry because Jacob realizes that it's only God who can give her children. And we see in the prior chapter that God is the one who's blessing Leah and giving her children. And so what Rachel should have done in this situation is not go to Jacob, but instead go to God. And Jacob says, "Am I in the place of God?" And so Rachel has the wrong reaction. And I think something that we can learn from this is a lot of times, a lot of our problems in our lives, even in our family life, just like in this situation, this was a problem within a family life. A lot of times the reason we have frustrations, the reason we have fights, the reason we have anger is because sometimes we're looking to get from other human beings what only God can give us. And in one sense, so like from Jacob's perspective, sometimes we put too much on ourselves and think we need to do this or we need to do that, and we put all this pressure on ourselves in order to accomplish things that we have no ability to accomplish. There are only certain things that can come from God, and sometimes we put too much pressure on ourselves, and sometimes our family members put too much pressure on us to accomplish things. Or it could be any situation, it could be any relationship where we put too much pressure on human beings to fulfill things for us that only God can fulfill for us. And so what that ends up doing is it causes a bunch of frustration, it causes a bunch of worry, it causes a bunch of strife because we don't have any control over certain things. Only God can give those things to us. And that's what's causing an issue in this situation, because Rachel is trying to get from Jacob what she should be going to God to get. And so the first lesson we can learn from this chapter is Christians can become frustrated when they try to get from people what God only can give to them. So we should look at our own lives and see how have we tried to get things from other people that we should be seeking from God. Sometimes we try to get approval from other people. Sometimes we try to get some sort of peace from other people or joy from other people when we should be getting these things from God. Because whatever other humans can provide you ultimately is temporary. But what God can give you can last for all of eternity. And so what we see in this situation that we can learn from Rachel is that we need to look at ourselves and see what are we trying to get from other people. Because when we don't get those things, sometimes we become frustrated. And the solution is when you find yourself seeking from humans what they can't provide you, is to turn to God. Because God can provide us with the things that other people aren't able to give us. Because God is almighty, He's the Lord of everything, and His riches are uncountable. And so He can provide us the things that other humans are unable to give us, or even that we are unable to give for ourselves. Now, moving on, we see that Rachel doesn't learn from this conversation. In verses 3 through 6, it says, "She said, 'Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children.' So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, 'God has vindicated me, and has indeed heard my voice, and has given me a son.' Therefore she named him Dan." So her response to this is the same thing that Sarah did earlier with Hagar, to give her servant as a wife to the husband. And she does this with Bilhah. And so she's following that same sort of pattern. She doesn't learn from the mistakes of Hagar. I don't know if she even knew that story. But she's following that pattern, and it's possible that that pattern existed in that culture broadly, because we see it happening more than once. But what I wanted to focus in on is she goes through this, and then her response in verse 6 is to say, "God has vindicated me, and has indeed heard my voice, and has given me a son." So she does this thing that is immoral. We know that it's immoral today. It was prominent in the culture there. It just, logically, it's an immoral thing because you're using your servant for something that a servant shouldn't be used for. And they're not in a position to object or anything along those lines. And so you see that it's not the correct way to live. It's not the right thing to do. It's her own plan, and it's not God providing her with a child. She's using someone else to get a child. But her response is to say, "God has vindicated me, and has indeed heard my voice, and has given me a son." And so I think one thing that we can learn from this is that Rachel is ascribing to God, she's giving glory to God, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's not really through God that she was given this child. She was given this child through her own plan, through her own manipulation, through her own idea. She was given this child through some earthly, fleshly approach, but then she's ascribing it to God. And sometimes this happens with Christians as well. We want something from God, and then we use our own immoral ways to get it, and then we act like God is the one who gave it to us. And that can happen to Christians, and that can happen to people in the church. We have to be very careful of things like that. Because if we do anything and we're using our flesh, we're using immoral things to gain them, or we're doing things that are against the Word of God in order to gain things, then those things aren't from God. And maybe we'll come here and give a testimony about how God gave us something. But if we had to go through our own fleshly ways to achieve those things, if we had to cut certain corners in order to get those things, then we shouldn't be. It's actually immoral to be ascribing that to God, because we have done something wicked to get something, but we're trying to give glory to God for that, and almost in a way passing the blame to God as well. And so that's something that Christians have to be very careful of, because Christians are really good at taking things that are worldly and then making them seem Christian, or adding God into it, or spiritualizing things that aren't spiritual. And we see that in the case of Rachel. And so I think something we can learn from this is that we need to be careful that we don't attribute the results that we're seeing from our own machinations to God. But instead, we should be people who are willing to follow God no matter what. That we're willing to do what's right no matter what, even if doing right seems like it's not going to get us the result that we want. Even if doing right isn't going to result in, or would make it harder for us to achieve what we're trying to achieve. We must choose to do the right thing, and even if it becomes an obstacle for us getting what we need, we must submit to God and trust that God can give us what we need. And we see examples of that throughout the scriptures. We see examples of that in so many different places. You can see it in the life of Joseph later on, that we'll see in the book of Genesis, that God is the one who lifts him up. He's not willing to do the wrong thing. He only does the right thing, even though it takes him further away from the dream that God gave him. You see that in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see that in the life of Daniel, that they weren't willing to compromise, and God is the one who got them to the place that they needed to go. They weren't willing to compromise on following God. They purposed in their heart to follow God, even if it seemed like, if you rationally looked at what they were doing, they were going backwards from the place that they were supposed to be. And so as Christians, we must be committed to following God and doing the right thing no matter what, because we have faith that God will take us to the place that we need to go, and we don't need to go down the wrong path. So finally, we see in verses 22 through 23, it says, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb." Just to quickly mention what happened since the verse that we looked at. So Leah sees that Rachel gets children through Bilhah, two children. And so Leah gives her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob. And then she ends up getting, she ends up getting a few more children. And then Leah herself ends up getting more children as well. So Leah continues to be blessed, and then she also, through her servant, gets more children. So finally, when we get to verse 22, it says, God remembers Rachel. And so here we actually see that God is intervening and giving Rachel a son. Verse 23, "So she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach." So here we see that God has truly taken away Rachel's reproach. She didn't have to go through other means. God gave her a child. And we see that God remembered Rachel. And that is what we should seek as Christians. we should seek that God would remember us. Not that we somehow manipulated the situation, somehow worked behind the scenes to try to gain something, but instead that God himself remembered us. And that is the greatest blessing. How God views us is the greatest blessing that any of us could have. If God remembers us, that is something that we should be proud of. And so, as Christians, this is what we should seek. We shouldn't seek trying to go down our own path, trying to work things out for ourselves, but we should seek the favor of God. Because God is the only one who can truly bless us. God is the only one who can truly transform us, and we should rely on him and not on our own methods. So the final point that I wanted to make is Christians can only be truly blessed if God looks favorably upon them. And so these were the three main things that I wanted to focus on today. First off, sometimes we can get frustrated because we rely too much on other people or we rely too much on ourselves to get what we're trying to achieve. And when we do that, that just leads to further and further frustration. And sometimes we may try to work things out our own way and cut corners and come up with our own schemes and not necessarily follow the Bible the entire way in order to get what we want. But those things aren't coming from God. And what we should truly seek is that God would look with favor on us. And so we must focus on our relationship with God and not seek things from other people or from ourselves, but seek things from God. Because if God blesses us, then we are truly blessed indeed. Now, the remainder of this chapter goes into another story about Jacob being blessed and Laban being blessed and the flocks being separated. And so I'm not going to go into that because it's a whole nother story. But this same theme exists throughout it because Laban talks about how he's blessed because Jacob is there. And he realizes that Jacob's presence, because God has blessed Jacob, is blessing Laban as well. So you see this concept of God looking with favor on Jacob, and because of that, Laban is blessed. And then you also see Laban comes up with a scheme to try to make it so Jacob doesn't have more flocks, that Jacob doesn't gain more sheep. And so Laban knows that Jacob is being blessed by God, but then he comes up with a scheme so that Laban will end up with most of the flock. But regardless, what ends up happening is Jacob ends up being blessed and getting more flocks. And so we see that the blessing of God is what matters at the end of the day. You can try all of your schemes, you can try all of your manipulations in the case of Laban, but ultimately who God blesses is truly blessed. And so in our lives, that is what we must focus on. We must focus on finding favor from God. And in order to have favor with God, we must have a relationship with God. We must be committed to following God no matter what, and not seek out our own goals or our own pursuits, but instead focus on pleasing God. Because when you focus on pleasing God, God will look with favor on you, and then you will be blessed by a blessing that is worth more than the blessings that this world can give you. Thank you.